The traveler had never heard of Hollowmoor before. It wasn't on any map, nor did the winding forest road suggest anything but an endless stretch of darkness. Thick fog clung to the twisted trees, their gnarled limbs reaching like skeletal fingers. His car sputtered as the gas meter blinked empty, a cruel joke played by fate. A lone wooden sign loomed ahead, half-rotted, yet its carved letters were unmistakable. "Welcome to Hollowmoor." As he stepped into the town, an eerie silence enveloped him, broken only by the soft crunch of his boots against the dirt road. The buildings stood old and decayed, their windows dark, reflecting nothing but emptiness. A foul stench hung in the air, a mix of damp earth and something rotten. Shadows darted behind buildings, too fast to be people, too large to be animals. He quickened his pace, but the street ahead stretched endlessly, as if mocking him. A single thought clawed its way into his mind. Something is wrong here. Then, just as he turned a corner, a distant, agonized scream shattered the silence. It was long, inhuman, and filled with a suffering no living thing should ever endure. And it was just the beginning. The traveler found shelter in what appeared to be an abandoned inn. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of dust and something metallic, something that sent an uneasy shiver down his spine. The wooden floor groaned beneath his weight as he stepped inside, the dim light from his flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. As night fell, the true horror of Hollowmoor began. At first, it was a distant wail, high-pitched, drawn out, like a soul being torn apart. Then another joined in. And another. Within minutes, the entire town was filled with an orchestra of suffering. The screams were everywhere, echoing through the streets, seeping through the walls, rattling the very air. He covered his ears, but the sound burrowed into his skull. It was unbearable, inhuman. Each scream carried something with it, desperation, agony, a plea for escape that would never come. He peered out the window and saw shadows writhing in the streets, shifting unnaturally. But there was no one there. The walls of the inn trembled. Something scratched at the door. And then, amidst the screams, came a whisper, low, guttural, and right behind him. "You shouldn't have come." Morning never truly arrived in Hollowmoor. A sickly gray light barely pierced the thick fog, and the screams, though distant now, still lingered in the air like a bad omen. The traveler's hands trembled as he gripped the rusted doorknob of the inn, hesitating before stepping outside. The town seemed deserted, yet it was alive with something unseen, something ancient. A figure stood at the edge of the town square, an old woman, draped in tattered cloth, her face gaunt and hollow. She beckoned him closer with a slow, skeletal hand. "You heard them, didn't you?" she rasped, her voice like wind through dead leaves. "The cursed ones. The ones who never stop screaming." The traveler swallowed hard. "What happened here?" The woman's eyes gleamed with something between sorrow and terror. "Hollowmoor was once like any other town," she whispered. "Until the debt came due." She told him of an ancient betrayal, of a desperate deal struck generations ago. A ritual meant to save the town had instead damned it, binding its people to eternal suffering. The screams were not just echoes of the past. They were the voices of those who still lived in agony, unseen but never gone. The traveler felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing against him as he left the old woman behind. The streets were empty, but the town was far from abandoned. Shadows slithered where they shouldn't, stretching too long, moving against the wind. Every step he took was met with a faint echo, as if something was following just out of sight. He turned a corner and froze. A row of houses stood ahead, their windows gaping like empty eye sockets. But in one of them, something moved. Not a person. Not an animal. A shape, tall, thin, and shifting unnaturally, as though it were struggling to hold form. His breath hitched. The air around him thickened, turning heavy, suffocating. The whispers began, low at first, like the wind, then rising, surrounding him. "Leave. Run." Too late. A sudden pressure gripped his shoulder. He spun around, but no one was there. Only his own shadow stretching toward the alley behind him, an alley where another shadow stood, waiting. He didn't need to see its face to know it was watching. And it was getting closer. The traveler ran. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, drowning out everything but the rising whispers that followed him through the empty streets. He didn't stop until he reached the crumbling remains of what seemed to be the town hall. The old woman's words echoed in his mind, until the debt came due. Inside, the building smelled of mold and decay. Faded paintings of long-dead townsfolk lined the walls, their eyes dark, hollow, accusing. A massive ledger sat open on a rotting desk, its pages filled with names, thousands of them, all scrawled in frantic, uneven handwriting. Some names were crossed out. Others were written over and over, as if their existence had been rewritten, reshaped. And then he saw it, a single passage in the book, its ink still fresh as though it had been written moments ago. For salvation, the town must sacrifice its voice. The chosen must suffer so that Hollowmoor may live. The realization clawed at his chest. The screams weren't just echoes of the dead. They were the voices of those paying the price. Another name had just been added at the bottom of the page. His own. Behind him, something exhaled, a slow, wet breath. A chilling gust swept through the decayed hall, carrying with it whispers that coiled around the traveler like unseen hands. The names in the ledger blurred before his eyes, as if they were shifting, changing. His own name darkened, the ink seeping through the brittle page like fresh blood. Then the wind spoke. Not in words, but in screams. It wasn't just one voice, nor a dozen, it was hundreds, thousands, shrieking through the very fabric of Hollowmoor. Some pleaded, others raged, but most simply wailed in agony, trapped in suffering without end. The traveler clutched his head, but the cries burrowed deep, twisting into his thoughts. He won't escape. Another has joined us. The pact is sealed. He staggered back, his breath ragged. The room had changed, the walls pulsed, the ceiling stretched impossibly high, and the portraits, they were watching him now. Their mouths hung open, their silent expressions frozen in torment. A hand, thin, decayed, with fingers far too long, emerged from the pages of the ledger, reaching for him. The wind screamed louder. And this time, it sounded like his own voice joining the chorus. The traveler stumbled out of the town hall, gasping for air. The whispers followed, weaving through the thick, stagnant fog that clung to the streets like a living thing. His mind screamed for only one thing, escape. He sprinted toward the edge of town, where the forest loomed like a blackened wall. The road he had arrived on was gone, swallowed by the mist. Instead, the path twisted in unnatural ways, looping back toward Hollowmoor no matter which way he turned. Behind him, the town pulsed with movement. Doors creaked open without a breeze, windows rattled, and unseen footsteps scraped against the cobbled streets. He wasn't alone. He saw a bridge in the distance, a rickety wooden thing stretching over a blackened river. A way out. He ran for it, but as his foot touched the first plank, a blood-curdling shriek tore through the air. The bridge shook violently, and then, it collapsed. The river below churned, thick and writhing, not with water but with faces. Pale, hollow-eyed figures reached up with twisted hands, their mouths forever open in endless, silent screams. And then he understood. No one had ever escaped Hollowmoor. And no one ever would. The traveler fell to his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The river of faces churned below, their mouths gaping in silent agony, their eyes locked onto him. He scrambled back, his body shaking, but the whispers in the wind had turned to laughter, mocking, knowing. A shadow loomed over him. He turned, and there, standing in the mist, was the old woman. "You see them now," she murmured, her voice hollow. "You understand, don't you?" The traveler's throat was too dry to speak. She stepped closer, her bones creaking like old wood. "We are all here," she whispered. "Bound. Cursed. Screaming, even when our voices fail. Her face twisted, eyes wide with despair. Because we are not dead. The traveler's stomach twisted. These weren't spirits. These were the living damned, trapped in an endless nightmare, their souls unable to leave, their suffering never ceasing. The town itself was alive, feeding on their torment. The old woman's mouth stretched open in a silent wail. The air trembled. The shadows surged forward. And then he knew, he was already one of them. His screams had simply not begun yet. The traveler's mind reeled as the truth crushed him. Hollowmoor was not just cursed, it was a prison. The suffering was eternal, and now, he was part of it. But the whispers slithering through the air offered something else. A way out. A way to break free. One must take the burden. One must replace the lost. Choose, or be chosen. The old woman, still standing before him, shook her head, her hollow eyes pleading. Don't listen to them, she rasped. There is no escape. There never was. But the traveler saw it now, the unbroken cycle. The town could not let someone leave unless another took their place. That was the nature of the pact. He had a choice. Sacrifice another soul to Hollowmoor, or remain here forever, screaming alongside the damned. A cold hand gripped his wrist. A frail man, one of the many shadows lurking in the mist, stared up at him with terror-filled eyes. A replacement. If he pushed this man forward, if he let Hollowmoor consume him instead, he could walk free. But at what cost? The air thickened. The town waited. The traveler's fingers trembled as they gripped the frail man's arm. The town pulsed around him, its whispers turning into an urgent chant. Choose. 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 The old woman stood motionless, her expression unreadable. The shadowed figures in the mist loomed closer, their faces stretched in silent agony. The river of damned souls below writhed in anticipation. Hollowmoor was hungry. The traveler's heart pounded. His mind screamed. If he didn't act, he would be trapped forever. With a deep, shuddering breath, he made his choice. A blood-curdling scream tore through the air. The town shuddered, the mist recoiled, and the shadows writhed in delight. A new voice had joined the chorus of suffering, one that would never stop. The traveler stumbled forward, his body shaking. He was free. The road that had vanished now stretched before him. The forest stood open, no longer a prison. The sky above, once suffocating, now held the faintest glimmer of light. But as he took his first step beyond Hollowmoor, he felt it. A weight in his chest. A scream, his own, buried deep within. He had left the town. But it had not left him. Somewhere, deep in the wind, his own voice began to whisper.